Hi class, today we will talk about psychological disorders. At UF, we have quite a bit resources for psychological well-being. We have You Matter, We Care. We also have a counseling and wellness center. It's free for students, and I think they continue to do online consultation. So if you need, just give them a call and make an appointment. We also have sexual assault recovery service. So if you know anyone who needs this information, feel free to forward it to them. Okay, so in this chapter, we will talk about uh, conceptions of mental illness, anxiety-related disorders, mood disorders and suicide, personality and dissociative disorder. For example, sometimes people claim they have it's like two different people living inside one body. Schizophrenia and the childhood disorders, autism and ADHD. Today, the Mental Health Bible is the DSM, Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Mental health professionals use it to diagnose mental disorders. Its first version was released in 1952, and we are now on our fifth version, the DSM-5. It provides official criteria, prevalence rates, and diagnostic rules for mental disorders. The DSM-5 consists of over 300 distinct diagnoses. Of course, we cannot cover all of them in our class, but we will hit a few highlights. The DSM-5 encourages mental health professionals to first think organic. What does it mean? It means look towards medical causes of a disorder before considering it a psychological condition. We need to rule out medical causes first. Also, it embraces biopsychosocial approach. Biology, psychology, and social are all the influences we must consider. Specifically, it reminds mental health professionals to attend carefully to patients' ongoing life stressors, past and present medical conditions, and overall level of functioning when evaluating their psychological status. It also reminds people to pay attention to cultural differences. What may be considered abnormal in one culture may not be in another, and we need to be culturally sensitive. So, while self-harm is generally considered to be a problem, such practices are sometimes used by certain cultures to produce tribal scars, so it's not abnormal in their culture. Next, we will talk about anxiety-related disorders. In small doses, anxiety can be adaptive. It can cue us to danger and push us towards action. For example, we know the exam is coming, so we feel a little bit anxious, but it gives us the motivation to, study hard. However, anxiety becomes a problem when it's in big doses all the time. Anxiety disorders typically have a pretty early onset, on average about 11 years old. Most anxiety disorders affect females more than males, so we can see a big spike of anxiety disorders in teenager girls. There are many forms of anxiety disorders. We are going to talk in more detail about the ones in bold. And please check out this video. It gives a really good introduction about anxiety and obsessive compulsive disorder. Everybody worries, but people with generalized anxiety disorder spend an average of 60% of their day worrying, as opposed to people who don't have this disorder spend 18% of their day worrying. People with generalized anxiety disorder tend to almost always feel on edge or worry about any number of things. One key here is that this is generalized. That is, people with generalized anxiety disorder are not only worried about social situations, they are not only worried about being sick, they are worried about everything. As a result, they often have difficulty in sleeping and always feel tense or irritable. How does it develop? Well, for about 1/3 of generalized anxiety disorder, it develops after a stressful life event. For the other 2/3, it might be something more subtle, or they might have a stronger genetic disposition. Okay, now let's talk about panic disorder. People with a panic disorder have to fulfill two main criteria. First is repeated and unexpected panic attacks. Second is persistent concerns about future panic attacks or change in behavior to attempt to avoid panic attacks. So, two things here. First, that person needs to experience panic attacks. Second, they need to have persistent concerns about future attacks. So, let's first talk about what is a panic attack. It typically consists of nervous feelings that escalate into fear and terror. People often experience physiological symptoms such as heart racing, blurry vision, sweating, dizziness, lightheadedness. These can be due to specific stimuli or out of the blue. I had a panic attack in February when I went to a conference. So I met this colleague unexpectedly, and I always feel nervous talking with him. So I had a panic attack. I feel heart racing. I feel sweating. So my panic attack was due to that specific person. Panic attacks can occur in every anxiety disorder, as well as some other psychological disorders. So what makes panic disorder different? It's this idea that not only is a person having these panic attacks, but that these panic attacks are creating a great deal of anxiety, and the person may take any number of measures to avoid the attacks, like not going to certain places, having certain security blankets with them, etc. Although I personally had that panic attack, but I don't think I have a panic disorder because I don't want to avoid that colleague in the future. I don't want to avoid conferences in the future. I don't have concerns about if I will have panic attacks in the future. So, because I don't meet the second criteria, so I don't think I have a panic disorder. Phobias can also be a psychological disorder. A phobia occurs when we experience a thought of intense fear that is disproportionate to the actual threat. So, for instance, if you have serious acrophobia, fear of heights, and you take a few steps up a ladder and panic, the amount of danger you are is much less than your fear leads you to believe. For you to actually be diagnosed with a phobia, it must restrict your life, create considerable distress, or both. Phobias are the most common of anxiety disorders. There are many forms of phobia. Agoraphobia is a fear of being in a situation in which escape is difficult or embarrassing. Some people think it means you are afraid of crowds or public places, but this is a misconception. It's just a fear of being in any sort of inescapable or embarrassing situation.
Phobia of objects, places, or situations, called specific phobias, commonly arise in response to animals, insects, thunderstorms, water, elevators, and darkness. Many of these fears, especially of animals, are widespread in childhood but disappear with age. Surveys show that most people rank public speaking as a greater fear than dying. Given that statistic, imagine how people with social anxiety disorder, sometimes called social phobia, must feel. They experience an intense fear of negative evaluation in social situations, such as while eating, giving a speech, have a conversation with other people, and performing in public. Their social fears can even extend to swimming, swallowing, and signing their checks in the presence of others.
If you experience or witness a particularly traumatic event, like combat, a natural disaster, physical or sexual assault, you are at risk for developing post traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. It's the emotional disturbance after experiencing severely stressful event. And when we think about PTSD, we often think about war heroes, war veterans. So, what are some of the symptoms of PTSD? First is flashbacks. The terror of war can return decades after the original trauma and be reactivated by everyday stressful experiences. The second symptom is avoiding reminders of the trauma. Reminders of the incident can trigger full-blown panic attacks, as in the case of a Vietnam veteran who hid under his bed whenever he heard a city helicopter in the distance. More than 20 years after the war ended, because the helicopter would remind him of the war. The third symptom is the heightened physiological arousal. It's reflected in difficulty sleeping and startling easily. So it's really difficult for people who suffer from PTSD to have a good sleep because they are constantly in this high physiological arousal. Okay, now we'll talk about obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. OCD is a condition that is marked by repeated and lengthy immersion in obsessions, compulsions, or both. Note that you don't need to have both to be classified as having OCD, although many do. Obsessions are persistent, unwanted ideas, thoughts, or urges. These are typically inappropriate. It's usually about sex, aggression, contamination, etc., and it causes distress. For example, individuals with OCD may be consumed with fears of being dirty or thoughts of killing others. Unlike ordinary warriors, people with OCD typically are disturbed by their thoughts and usually see themselves as irrational. They may even label themselves as crazy or dangerous. Yeah, that's obsessions. The compulsions component is the behavioral mental act component, whereas obsessions are the thoughts, impulses, compulsions are intentional behavioral or mental acts that aim to reduce or prevent stress. These can include things like repeatedly checking logs, ovens, etc., performing a certain specific set of tasks, rearranging objects, cleaning repeatedly, counting, etc. Many people without OCD occasionally engage in one or more of these activities. We have all done that, like check our logs. Nevertheless, individuals with OCD spend an hour or more a day immersed in obsessions, compulsions, or both. So, how do anxiety disorders develop? One way is through learning. According to learning models, we can develop anxiety disorders via classical conditioning, and they are maintained via operant conditioning. That is, we grow to associate certain stimuli with anxiety, and through our behaviors, thoughts, etc., and via reward and punishment, our anxiety disorders continue and may even get worse. We can also develop our fear through observation from others. That is, if we as a child see our parent react really negatively towards dogs, we may learn to develop a fear of dogs. We may also learn our fears through misinformation. For example, sometimes adults make fun of children and they say, oh, if you swallow the watermelon seed, it will grow in your stomach. And the children may take it seriously, and the fear of swallow watermelon seed may stay with them forever. So please don't make those jokes to children. They may, believe them forever. Anxious people also tend to have a different way of thinking. They are prone to catastrophic thinking. In other words, predicting terrible events despite low probability. They are also prone to interpret ambiguous situations negatively, thinking someone was ignoring you when they may simply have not heard you. In a study, researchers asked participants to listen to words that sound the same but have two different meanings and spellings, and write down the word they heard. Compared to non-anxious participants, anxious participants are more likely to write down the version of the word that is threatening, such as die instead of die. Anxious people are also particularly sensitive to anxiety. They have more of a fear of anxiety-related symptoms. Think of the time you felt a bit dizzy when you stood up quickly or your heart raced after you climbed stairs. You probably dismissed these physical symptoms as harmless. Yet people with a high anxiety sensitivity tend to misinterpret them as dangerous and act with intense worry. Twin studies show that many anxiety-related disorders, including panic disorder, specific phobias, PTSD, and OCD, are genetically influenced. Researchers found that genes influence neuroticism. For people who are high in neuroticism, they are easy to be nervous, upset, guilt-prone, and irritable. People who are high in neuroticism are more likely to develop anxiety disorders and depression. OCD is characterized by difficulties shifting from a particular thought or behavior. It is linked to abnormalities in frontal lobe, which is related to inhibition of thoughts, behaviors, and organization of information. We have learned that frontal lobe is our control center. Okay, next, we'll learn about mood disorders and suicide. Mood disorders are disorders where one experiences difficulties with having a lingering negative mood, or in the case of bipolar disorder, shifting from extreme lows to extreme highs. Mood disorders affect pretty much all aspects of daily life. They tend to be pretty prevalent. Over 20% of Americans will experience a mood disorder at some point in their lives, with major depressive disorder being the most common. Mood disorders are most common in people in their 30s, less common in older adults than young adults.
So Paul Gilbert said, depression has been labeled the common cold of psychopathology. This comparison is unfortunate, for it conveys the impression of a frequent but mild complaint. In reality, depression is not only the most frequent mental health problem, but is among the most serious. Let's first talk about major depressive disorder. As I said, it's the most common of mood disorders. It can develop either gradually or suddenly. Major depressive disorder is characterized by major depressive episodes. It's the states in which a person experiences depressed mood, diminished interest in pleasurable activities, along with other symptoms. On average, depressive episode lasts somewhere between 6 months to a year, but it can last as long as decades. Major depressive disorder can be quite impairing to many areas of daily life, make it a particularly potent disorder. How does major depressive disorder arise? It really is biopsychosocial, in that it is a blend of biological, psychological, and social influences. Researchers also find that it is more common in women than men. It may be the differences in economic power, sex hormones, social support, history of sexual and physical abuse. It may be due to undiagnosed in men, because men are taught to act tough. Men are less likely to go to mental health professionals for help. In the next class, we will continue to talk about different mood disorders, and we will finish the last 3 sections of this chapter.